The small chapel was suffocating with white lilies and whispered prayers when Uncle Frank stood beside my son's coffin and declared to everyone, "God saves the good children from this wicked world. He takes the cursed ones early before they can spread their poison." My name is Verona, and 3 days ago I buried my 6-year-old son, Colby. But this isn't just a story about loss. This is about the moment when grief turned into horror, when a funeral became a crime scene, and when a child's innocent words exposed a truth so dark that it shattered our entire family. The chapel was packed that morning. My brother Damon sat in the front row, his jaw clenched, the way it always did when he thought he was being righteous. My mother Judith clutched her pearl necklace, the one she wore to every family tragedy like armor. Warren, my ex-husband, slumped in a back pew, trying to hide the flask in his jacket pocket. Aunt Lisa sat perfectly still beside Uncle Frank, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had turned white. My cousin Gemma kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. And then there was little Ryder, Colby's best friend, sitting between his parents in his too big suit, his dinosaur tie crooked, his feet swinging because they couldn't reach the floor. Uncle Frank had insisted on giving the eulogy. "As the spiritual head of this family," he'd said, "it's my duty." No one had argued. No one ever argued with Uncle Frank. But this wasn't a eulogy. As Frank stood at that podium, gripping its edges like he was delivering Judgment Day itself, his words cut through the air like knives. "Some children are born blessed," he continued, his voice echoing off the chapel walls. "Others are born into sin, raised in broken homes by broken people. Perhaps God, in his infinite wisdom, called young Colby home before that poison could take root and spread." My brother Damon nodded slowly, deliberately, like he'd been waiting for someone to finally say it out loud. His wife Patricia squeezed his hand in approval. My mother, Judith, leaned toward her sister and whispered just loud enough for our entire row to hear, "Like mother, like son. Some families are just marked by failure. I couldn't keep my marriage together, and neither could Verona. Now look what's happened." The words hit me like physical blows. My baby, my sweet Colby, who insisted on saying goodnight to every stuffed animal so they wouldn't feel left out, who saved half his sandwich at lunch to feed the birds, who told me every single day that I was the best mommy in the whole wide world, was being condemned at his own funeral. I sat there frozen, my hands trembling on the funeral program that featured Colby's kindergarten photo, his gap-toothed smile beaming up at me. The photo was from Spring Picture Day, just 2 months ago. He'd insisted on wearing his lucky dinosaur socks that day, even though they didn't match his outfit. "Dinosaurs make everything better. Mommy," he'd said. The chapel felt like it was spinning. The smell of those lilies was making me sick. Everyone was nodding along to Frank's poison, these people who claimed to love us, who brought casseroles after the accident, who said they were praying for us. They sat there absorbing Frank's hatred like it was gospel. That's when I felt a small tug on my sleeve. Ryder had left his seat and walked up to me, his little face serious and determined. His father tried to grab him, but Ryder dodged his reach and stood right in front of me. The entire chapel fell silent, watching this 7-year-old boy approach the grieving mother everyone had just been condemning. "Mrs. Verona," Ryder said, his voice clear and carrying in the sudden quiet, "I need to tell you something." Colby told me a secret about Uncle Frank. He told me what Uncle Frank said to him that night at the lake house, the night before he died. The silence in the chapel became something else entirely. It became electric, dangerous. Ryder looked directly at Uncle Frank, then back at me. "Colby was really scared, Mrs. Verona. He made me promise to tell you if anything bad happened to him. He said Uncle Frank told him something terrible at the dock when everyone else was watching fireworks. Should I tell everyone what Uncle Frank said to him that night?" The sound of breaking glass shattered the silence like a gunshot. Aunt Lisa had been holding a glass of water with shaking hands, and it had slipped, crashed, exploded across the marble floor. She stood there frozen, staring at the glittering shards around her feet like they were pieces of her life falling apart. "Ryder!" Uncle Frank's voice boomed from the podium, but for the first time I could remember, there was fear in it. Children make up stories. This is not the time or place for games. But Ryder didn't even look at him. He kept his eyes on me, this brave little boy in his dinosaur tie, holding a truth that was about to destroy everything we thought we knew about Colby's death. "It's not a story, Mrs. Verona," Ryder said softly. "Colby was my best friend. Best friends don't lie to each other, and he told me everything." 3 days before the funeral, I was still in that hazy space between nightmare and reality. Every morning, I woke up expecting to hear Colby's feet padding down the hallway, his voice calling out, asking if we could have pancakes for breakfast. Instead, I woke to silence and the weight of knowing I'd never hear those sounds again. Colby had drowned at our family's annual 4th of July gathering at Uncle Frank's lake house. It was supposed to be a celebration, the one time each year when the entire extended family came together. Frank's property stretched across 10 acres with a private lake, a dock, and enough space for all the cousins to run wild while the adults pretended we were still a functional family. I hadn't wanted to go. The previous year's gathering had been a disaster when Frank cornered me about my divorce, lecturing me for 2 hours about the sanctity of marriage, while Warren passed out drunk in the boathouse. But Colby had been so excited. He'd been counting down the days, planning all the games he'd play with Ryder, talking about the fireworks and the sparklers, and how Uncle Frank promised to let him help with the grill this year. "Please, Mommy," he'd begged, his brown eyes wide with hope. "Ryder says his mom is making her special chocolate cake, and Uncle Frank said I could ride in his boat if I was extra good." So we went. We always went. That was the thing about Uncle Frank's invitations. They weren't really invitations at all. They were summons disguised as family gatherings, and absence was noted, discussed, and held against you for years. The day had started normally enough. Colby and Ryder had immediately run off together, their laughter echoing across the lake as they collected rocks and searched for frogs. My cousin Gemma had given me a sympathetic hug when we arrived, whispering, "Just avoid Dad today. He's in one of his moods." But Frank's moods were like thunderstorms. You could see them coming, but there was nowhere to hide when they hit. He'd found me setting up the dessert table, and his opening words were, "Verona, I've been praying for you." In Frank's vocabulary, praying for someone meant he'd been cataloging their sins and preparing a sermon. "This broken home situation isn't healthy for Colby," he'd said, arranging and rearranging the plastic forks with obsessive precision. "Boys need strong male role models, not mothers who can't keep their marriages together." "Warren was drunk more than he was sober," I'd replied, trying to keep my voice level. "That's not a role model, it's a cautionary tale." Frank's face had darkened. "Marriage is sacred, Verona. You don't abandon it because things get difficult. Your mother understood that when your father left. She never remarried, never dishonored those vows." "My mother spent 30 years bitter and alone," I shot back, immediately regretting it when I saw my mother Judith across the lawn, close enough to have heard. The rest of the afternoon had been tense but manageable. Warren had shown up 3 hours late with his new girlfriend Brittany, who looked barely old enough to drink and kept calling everyone babe, like she was hosting a reality show. My brother Damon made pointed comments about keeping families intact for the children, while his wife Patricia nodded along like a bobblehead doll. As the sun set, everyone gathered on the main lawn for the fireworks. I remembered looking for Colby in the crowd of children, finally spotting his bright red shirt near the dock. He was alone, which was unusual since he and Ryder had been inseparable all day. Frank was walking toward him with that purposeful stride that meant he had something to say. "I'll be right back," I told Gemma, but she'd grabbed my arm. "Mom needs help with the sparklers," she'd said urgently. "Could you give us a hand?" By the time I'd helped distribute sparklers to 24 excited children and made sure everyone had drinks for the fireworks show, 20 minutes had passed. The first firework exploded overhead in a shower of gold and blue, and I searched for Colby's red shirt again. That's when I heard the scream. Not a child's delighted shriek at the fireworks, but Gemma's voice, raw and terrified. "Someone help! There's a boy in the water." The next minutes were a blur of running, shouting, diving. Gemma pulled Colby from the water, while Frank stood on the dock, soaking wet, claiming he'd jumped in right away, but the boy had hit his head. It happened so fast there was nothing anyone could do. The paramedics tried for 40 minutes. 40 minutes that felt like hours and seconds simultaneously. They pronounced him dead at 9:47 p.m., while fireworks still lit up the sky in celebration. Now, 3 days later, sitting in this chapel with these people who claimed to mourn him while condemning his existence, I realized I'd never really known what happened in those 20 minutes by the dock. But Ryder did. And Uncle Frank's reaction to this 7-year-old boy's words told me everything I needed to know. Colby's death wasn't the accident we'd been told it was. Uncle Frank's words at the podium cut through my grief like shards of ice. He wasn't giving a eulogy, he was delivering a sermon about divine judgment, and my dead son was his cautionary tale. Some bloodlines carry darkness, Frank continued, his voice filling every corner of the chapel. Young Colby was born into sin, raised in a broken home by a mother who chose her own selfish desires over the sanctity of marriage. Perhaps the Lord showed mercy by calling him home before that poison could take root. The congregation shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. No one ever spoke up against Frank. He'd been the self-appointed patriarch of our family since my grandfather died 15 years ago, using his wealth and his warped version of Christianity like weapons to keep everyone in line. My brother Damon actually nodded, his face a mask of righteous agreement. "It's true," he murmured to his wife Patricia, loud enough for our Row to hear. "Some children never have a chance." The rage building inside me was volcanic, but my body wouldn't move. How could they turn my baby's funeral into a judgment of my failures? Colby had been pure light in this world. He kept a journal of happy things to read when he felt sad. He made friendship bracelets for kids who sat alone at lunch. He insisted on visiting the elderly neighbor next door every Sunday because Mr. Peterson's eyes get sparkly when I show him my drawings. My mother Judith leaned toward her sister Ruth, her stage whisper carrying across 3 rows. I warned Verona about divorcing Warren. I told her children need stability. Now look what's happened. Like mother, like son. I couldn't keep my marriage together either, and it destroyed our family. History, repeating itself. "Mrs. Henderson," someone behind me whispered, "perhaps this isn't the time." "The truth needs to be spoken," my mother replied sharply. "If we'd been honest about Verona's choices earlier, maybe Colby would still be alive." That's when little Ryder stood up from his seat beside his parents. His father, Michael, tried to pull him back down, but Ryder yanked his arm free and walked straight toward me with the determination of someone carrying an important message. The entire chapel watched as this 7-year-old boy navigated through the pews, his dinosaur tie crooked, his dress shoes clicking against the marble floor. He stopped right in front of me, ignoring the hundreds of eyes on him. "Mrs. Verona," Ryder said, his voice clear and strong, "Colby told me a secret about Uncle Frank. He said Uncle Frank told him something bad at the lake. Should I tell everyone what Uncle Frank said to him that night?" The crash of Aunt Lisa's glass was explosive in the silence. She'd been holding it with trembling hands throughout Frank's speech, and now it lay in pieces at her feet, water spreading across the marble like spilled secrets. She stood frozen, staring at the shattered glass, her face pale as paper. "What did Uncle Frank say, sweetheart?" I asked Ryder, my voice steady despite my hammering heart. For the first time in 3 days, I felt something other than crushing grief. I felt the dangerous electricity of truth about to strike. Uncle Frank stepped down from the podium, his heavy footsteps echoing. His face was flushed, that particular shade of red that appeared when someone challenged his authority. "Children make up stories," he said, his voice booming. "This is highly inappropriate for a funeral. Ryder, go back to your parents immediately." But Ryder didn't move. He looked at me, then at Frank, then back at me. Colby wasn't making it up. He was crying really hard when he found me hiding behind the boathouse. He said Uncle Frank hurt his feelings real bad. Angela, Ryder's mother, stood up slowly. She was a pediatric nurse, someone who knew the difference between children's fantasies and truth. "My son doesn't lie, Frank, especially not about something this serious." She walked over to us, putting her hand protectively on Ryder's shoulder. "Go ahead, baby. Tell Mrs. Verona what Colby said." The chapel erupted in whispers. People were pulling out phones, recording. Others were ushering their children outside. The minister stood helplessly at the side, clearly unsure whether to intervene. Frank's voice rose above the chaos. "This is ridiculous. I'm being accused by a 7-year-old child who's obviously confused by grief. Colby's death was an accident. I tried to save him." "Then why are you so afraid of what Ryder has to say?" Warren suddenly spoke up from the back of the chapel. For once his words weren't slurred. He stood up, his suit wrinkled, but his eyes clear and focused. "If you have nothing to hide, Frank, let the boy speak." Gemma rose from her seat, her face a mixture of confusion and growing horror. "Dad, what did you say to Colby? What did you do?" Aunt Lisa still hadn't moved from her spot by the broken glass. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the tense silence, everyone heard her. "Tell them, Ryder. Tell them everything." "What did Uncle Frank say, sweetheart?" I repeated, kneeling down to meet Ryder's eyes. My voice was calm, but inside every nerve was firing. This 7-year-old boy held a truth that could explain everything, and I needed to hear it. Ryder took a deep breath, his small hands fidgeting with his dinosaur tie. "Colby said Uncle Frank took him to the dock when everyone was watching fireworks. Uncle Frank told him he was a bad seed, just like his mommy. He said God would punish bad children who came from broken homes. He said Colby would grow up to be worthless, just like you, Mrs. Verona." The chapel went completely silent. Even the whispers stopped. I felt the blood drain from my face, but I kept my eyes on Ryder, encouraging him to continue. "Colby was crying really hard," Ryder continued, his own eyes filling with tears. "He asked me if God really hated him. He said Uncle Frank grabbed his arm real tight and wouldn't let go. He showed me the marks. They were purple and shaped like fingers." Gemma gasped from her seat, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God! Dad, tell me you didn't grab a 6-year-old child. Tell me you didn't say those things." Frank's face had gone from red to purple. "This is preposterous." The boy is confused. "Children misinterpret adult conversations all the time. I was trying to provide spiritual guidance." "Spiritual guidance?" Warren walked up the aisle, his steps surprisingly steady. "You call terrorizing a 6-year-old spiritual guidance? What kind of monster tells a child that God hates him?" "I was trying to save his soul," Frank shouted, his composure finally cracking. Someone had to tell the boy the truth about his situation. His mother's sin of divorce, the broken home, the lack of proper masculine influence. These things have consequences. "The only consequence here is what you did," Angela said, her voice sharp with professional authority. "Ryder, did Colby tell you anything else?" Ryder nodded, wiping his nose with his sleeve. "Colby said he tried to run away, but Uncle Frank followed him onto the dock. He kept yelling about sin and hell and how Colby's mommy was going to burn forever. Colby was backing up because he was scared, and then he said everything went dark." Aunt Lisa suddenly moved, her heels crunching on the broken glass. "There's more," she said, her voice stronger now. "I saw it happen. I followed Frank to the dock because I knew that look in his eyes. I've seen it before when his temper snaps." "Lisa, don't you dare," Frank warned, but his voice had lost its power. "No, I'm done protecting you," Lisa said, turning to face the congregation. "I watched Frank corner that little boy on the dock. Colby was terrified trying to get around him, but Frank kept blocking his path. He was shouting about damnation and sin while that baby cried for his mother." My legs nearly gave out. Warren caught my arm, steadying me, while Angela held my other side. "Keep going, Lisa," I managed to say. "Please, I need to know everything." Lisa's hands were shaking, but her voice grew steadier with each word. "Colby tried to dodge around Frank one more time, but Frank grabbed him again. Harder this time. Colby pulled away so violently that he lost his balance. He stumbled backward, his arms windmilling, and then he fell off the dock. His head hit the edge as he went down. And then... The voice was my mother's, Judith, who had been silent since her cruel whispers earlier. Her face was white with horror. "Frank stood there," Lisa said, her voice breaking. "He stood there for at least 30 seconds, maybe longer, just watching the water where Colby went under. I screamed at him to jump in, but he just stood there like he was making a decision, like he was weighing whether that little boy deserved to be saved." The chapel erupted. People were shouting, crying, some trying to get to Frank while others held them back. Damon had collapsed into his seat, his head in his hands, while Patricia rubbed his back mechanically, her face blank with shock. When he finally went in, Lisa continued, having to raise her voice over the chaos, it was too late. Maybe if he'd jumped immediately, if those 30 seconds hadn't been wasted while he played God, Colby would still be alive. I found my voice then, and it came out as a roar that silenced the room. You watched my baby drown while you decided if he was worth saving? You let him die because you thought we were sinners? Frank straightened his shoulders, trying to reclaim his authority. It was God's will. The boy's death was predetermined by the sins of his family. I was merely an instrument. You were a murderer, Warren said flatly, and you're about to be a prisoner. That's when we heard the sirens. Someone, probably Angela, who still had her phone out, had called 911. The police were coming, and Uncle Frank's reign of terror disguised as religious authority was finally ending. But for Colby, it was 30 seconds too late. The chapel doors burst open and 2 police officers entered, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from chaos to something more official, more final. But Aunt Lisa wasn't finished. She raised her hand to stop them, her voice commanding attention. Wait, she said. There's more they need to hear. Frank, tell them about the insurance policy. Tell them about the conversation you had with your lawyer last month. Frank's face went from purple to white in seconds. Lisa, that has nothing to do with this. The hell it doesn't, Lisa shot back, her decades of suppressed anger finally breaking free. Officers, my husband took out a life insurance policy on every child in this family 2 years ago. He's the beneficiary if anything happens to them. He called it protecting the family's financial future. Gasps echoed through the chapel. Parents instinctively pulled their children closer. My mind was reeling, trying to process this new horror on top of everything else. Gemma stood up slowly, her face a mask of dawning realization. That's why you insisted on having all the family gatherings at your house. That's why you always wanted the kids to play by the lake unsupervised while you watched from the deck. You were waiting for an accident. That's absurd, Frank shouted, but his voice cracked. I was protecting this family's assets. It's completely legal and reasonable. What's not legal, one of the officers said, stepping forward, is criminal negligence resulting in death, or premeditated murder, depending on what our investigation finds. He pulled out handcuffs. Frank Morrison, you're under arrest for suspicion of involuntary manslaughter and child endangerment. You can't arrest me based on the testimony of a 7-year-old and my hysterical wife. Frank backed toward the altar, his eyes wild. That's when my mother, Judith, stood up. Her face was streaked with tears, her perfectly applied makeup running in black rivers down her cheeks. I can testify, too, she said quietly. I saw Frank push Colby. The entire chapel turned to stare at her. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. Mom? I whispered. She looked at me, her eyes full of shame and regret. I was walking to the dock to watch the fireworks from there. It's quieter, away from the crowd. I saw Frank with Colby. I saw him grab Colby's arms and shake him. I saw Colby try to run, and I saw Frank's hand on Colby's chest when he fell. It wasn't just a stumble. Frank pushed him. Then why didn't you say anything? I screamed, Warren having to physically hold me back from lunging at her. Why did you let me think it was an accident? Why did you stand there and blame me for my divorce while my son's killer walked free? Because I was a coward, my mother said, her voice broken. Because Frank has controlled this family for so long that I didn't think anyone would believe me. Because I've spent so many years believing his poison about broken families and sin that I convinced myself maybe it was God's will. But hearing Ryder speak up, seeing this child have more courage than all of us adults combined, I can't stay silent anymore. Damon stood up then, his face gray. I saw something too, he admitted. I saw Frank coming back from the dock, soaking wet, and he was smiling. He was actually smiling, he said. The Lord works in mysterious ways. I thought he meant surviving the rescue attempt, but now I realize he meant Colby's death. The officer moved toward Frank, who was now backed against the altar. Sir, please turn around and put your hands behind your back. This is persecution, Frank shouted. I'm a man of God. Everything I did was to protect this family from sin and degradation." "What you did," the second officer said, pulling out a notebook, "was murder a 6-year-old child. And from what we're hearing, you've been abusing this family psychologically for years." As they handcuffed Frank, Ryder tugged on my sleeve again. "Mrs. Verona, there's one more thing. Colby wanted me to give you something if anything bad happened." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small rock, smooth and gray with a white stripe through the middle. He said this was his most special rock because it looked like a heart if you turned it the right way. He wanted you to have it so you'd remember he loves you forever and ever. I took the rock with trembling hands, and for the first time since Colby died, I let myself completely break down. Warren held me on one side, and surprisingly, Gemma came to hold me on the other. Even Angela knelt beside us, creating a circle of support while the police led Frank away. "Wait!" Frank shouted as they reached the door. "You're making a mistake!" "That boy was damned. His whole family is damned. I was saving them from themselves." The officer paused at the door. "The only one damned here is you, Mr. Morrison, and you did it to yourself." As the police car pulled away with Frank in the back, Aunt Lisa walked over to me. "I'm so sorry, Verona. I should have spoken up sooner. I should have protected Colby. I failed him, and I failed you." The truth was finally out, but it came at the ultimate price. My son was gone, and no amount of justice would bring him back. The police took Frank that afternoon, but the real reckoning for our family had just begun. The investigation that followed revealed things none of us had imagined. Frank had been documenting what he called evidence of sin in journals going back 15 years. Pages and pages detailing every divorce, every mistake, every moment of human frailty in our family with elaborate plans for correction through what he termed divine intervention. The prosecutor called me 3 weeks later. "We found more insurance policies," she said, "not just on the children. On you, on your brother, on anyone Frank deemed spiritually corrupt. Colby wasn't his first attempt, Verona. He was just his first success. They found evidence that Frank had tampered with my brother's car brakes 2 years earlier, causing an accident Damon barely survived. He'd put allergens in my cousin Rebecca's food at a family dinner, sending her to the hospital with what we'd thought was random anaphylaxis. Each incident was carefully documented in his journals as tests of faith and opportunities for divine judgment. Aunt Lisa filed for divorce the same day Frank was arrested. She moved in with Gemma and started therapy, finally processing 40 years of psychological abuse. I knew he was controlling, she told me during one of our coffee meetings, but I never imagined he was capable of murder. I should have left him decades ago. Maybe if I had, Colby would still be alive. My mother Judith came to my apartment a month after the funeral, looking like she'd aged 10 years. She stood at my door for a full minute before speaking. "I failed you as a mother," she said simply. "I let my own bitterness about my failed marriage poison how I saw yours. I made you feel like damaged goods, and I stood by while Frank terrorized our family. I'll never forgive myself for not protecting Colby, for not speaking up when I saw what happened. I'm in therapy now, trying to understand how I became so twisted by Frank's influence that I blamed you at your own son's funeral." The healing didn't happen overnight. Damon wrote me a long letter admitting he'd been jealous of my courage to leave a bad marriage when he was too scared to examine his own unhappiness. He and Patricia separated 2 months after the funeral. "You were never the family failure," he wrote. "You were the only one brave enough to choose happiness over appearances. Frank made us believe suffering was holy, that misery was godly. You proved him wrong by walking away. Warren got sober after the funeral and stayed sober. We didn't reconcile romantically, but we found a friendship in our shared grief and shared determination to see justice done." He testified at Frank's trial about years of manipulation, how Frank had told him at our wedding that I would ruin him like all wayward women do, planting seeds of resentment before we even had a chance at happiness. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Frank was convicted of involuntary manslaughter and aggravated child abuse. He got 25 years, though no amount of time would ever feel like enough. During his sentencing, he showed no remorse, insisting until the end that he was doing God's work. The judge's response was sharp. "Mr. Morrison, You confused playing God with serving God. That confusion cost a child his life. At Colby's memorial tree planting 6 months later, the crowd was smaller but more genuine. Ryder read a poem he'd written. Colby was sunshine in a jar, catching fireflies and wishing on stars. Bad people might say mean things that aren't true, but good friends remember the real you. Angela Ryder's mother had started a foundation in Colby's name to help families recognize and escape religious abuse. No child should die because someone thinks they have the right to play judge and executioner in God's name, she said at the first fundraiser. I keep Colby's rock collection on my windowsill now, including that special heart-shaped rock Ryder gave me at the funeral. Every morning I hold it and remember my son's pure spirit that no amount of Frank's poison could actually touch. Colby died believing he was loved, because despite Frank's final cruel words, my son knew the truth of who he was. A bright, beautiful soul who made the world better just by being in it. I learned that sometimes the most dangerous storms come from within our own families, disguised as concern and righteousness. Evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious cruelty. Sometimes it wears a cross, quotes scripture, and hosts family gatherings. Frank had worn his abuse like holy armor, convincing us all that his cruelty was love, his control was protection, his judgment was guidance. But I also learned that truth, even when it comes from the smallest voice in the room, has the power to shatter the strongest facades. Ryder, at 7 years old, had more courage than all the adults who had stayed silent for years. He reminded us that protecting children isn't about controlling them or condemning their families. It's about creating space for them to be safe, loved, and free to grow. Colby's legacy wasn't one of tragedy, but of revelation. His death exposed the poison that had been slowly killing our family for generations. In losing him, we finally found the courage to cut out the cancer that was Frank's influence. We learned to question authority that demands blind obedience, to challenge faith that promotes hatred, and to recognize that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply accepting people as they are. Thank you for listening to Colby's story. If this story resonated with you, if you've experienced similar control or abuse disguised as religious concern, know that you're not alone. Your voice matters, your truth matters, and it's never too late to speak up. Please like this video if it touched you, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and leave a comment with your own thoughts or experiences. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that shed light on difficult truths and remind us all of the power of courage, even when it comes from the smallest among us. Remember, sometimes it takes a child's innocence to expose an adult's evil, and sometimes the greatest tragedy can lead to the most necessary transformation.